The studio froze. Morgan Freeman stood up with an envelope in his hands, and no one understood what was happening. It was supposed to be just another Tuesday night at The Tonight Show. The kind of night where Jimmy Fallon would crack jokes, play games with A-list celebrities, and send America home with a smile. But what happened that evening shattered every expectation, broke every protocol, and left the most talkative host in television history completely speechless. Morgan Freeman wasn't even scheduled to be there. He was supposed to be promoting his latest film during Thursday's taping. But on this particular Tuesday, he was sitting quietly in the third row of the audience, wearing a simple gray suit, a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. No one recognized him. Not the staff. Not the other audience members. Not even Jimmy himself. And in his pocket, folded carefully, was a letter that would change everything. The show started like it always does. Jimmy's monologue hit every beat perfectly. The audience laughed on cue. The Roots played their signature intro. Everything was running like clockwork. A young comedian was scheduled as the first guest, followed by a musical performance, and then the usual desk bit to close out the night. But fate had other plans. During the commercial break after the monologue, a production assistant noticed something unusual. An older woman in the front row was crying silently, clutching a photograph to her chest. Her name was Eleanor, and she had traveled from a small town in Ohio, nearly 600 miles, to be in that audience. She had written a letter weeks earlier, a letter she hoped would somehow reach Jimmy Fallon. She didn't know how. She didn't know when. She just knew she had to try. The letter was about her grandson, Michael. A 19-year-old kid who had spent the last 3 years battling leukemia. Michael had one dream: to meet Jimmy Fallon. He watched The Tonight Show every single night from his hospital bed. Even on the days when the pain was unbearable, even when the chemo made him so weak he could barely keep his eyes open, he would wait until 11:35 p.m. to watch Jimmy's monologue. He said Jimmy made him forget he was sick. Eleanor would later tell reporters. For 45 minutes every night, my grandson got to laugh again. But 2 weeks before this taping, Michael lost his battle. He never got to meet his hero. And Eleanor couldn't let that story end there. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The production assistant brought Eleanor's letter backstage during the commercial break. The stage manager read it quickly, then read it again, slower this time. His hands were shaking. He walked directly to Jimmy's dressing room, knocked once, and didn't wait for an answer. Jimmy was fixing his tie in the mirror, rehearsing a joke in his head for the next segment. The stage manager handed him the letter without saying a word. Jimmy read the first paragraph. Then the second. By the third, he had to sit down. The letter was written in Eleanor's careful handwriting. She described Michael's love for the show. How he would quote Jimmy's jokes to the nurses. How he learned to play the ukulele because Jimmy played one in a sketch. How on his worst days, when the doctors said there was nothing more they could do, Michael would still smile when The Tonight Show came on. And then Eleanor wrote something that broke Jimmy completely. I know you'll never see this. I know you get thousands of letters. But I needed to write it anyway. Because my Michael believed in you. He believed that good people still exist in this world. He believed that laughter is a kind of medicine. And even though he's gone, I need you to know that you gave him something precious. You gave him joy when there was none left to find. Jimmy didn't move for a full minute. When he finally looked up at the stage manager, his eyes were red. Is she here? Jimmy asked quietly. Front row. Third seat from the left. Jimmy stood up. He straightened his tie. He took a deep breath. And then he did something he'd never done in 10 years of hosting The Tonight Show. He walked onto the stage, mid-show, during what was supposed to be a pre-taped segment, and stopped everything. The audience was confused. The cameras kept rolling, unsure if this was part of a bit. The director in the control room started frantically asking through the headsets what was happening. Jimmy Fallon stood center stage, holding the letter, and the entire studio fell silent. I need to do something, Jimmy said, his voice unsteady. This isn't planned. This isn't in the script. But I just read something backstage and I can't continue the show without addressing it. He looked directly at Eleanor. Ma'am, in the third row. With the photograph. Would you please stand up? Eleanor didn't move at first. She couldn't believe he was talking to her. The woman next to her gently touched her arm and nodded. Slowly, Eleanor stood, still clutching Michael's photo. Jimmy walked down the stage steps, something hosts almost never do during a live taping. He walked directly to Eleanor, and when he reached her, he knelt down so they were at eye level. I read your letter, he said softly, but his microphone picked up every word. I read it and I don't have the words. Eleanor's hands were trembling. You don't have to say anything, she whispered. I just wanted you to know. But Jimmy shook his head. No. You came all this way. Your grandson deserved more than I ever gave him. And I need everyone here to know his story. That's when Morgan Freeman stood up. No one had noticed him until that moment. The baseball cap came off. The gray suit. The unmistakable presence. The entire audience gasped. Morgan walked slowly down the aisle, and as he approached, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the letter. Eleanor's letter. The one the stage manager had photocopied and, in a moment of desperate inspiration, handed to the one person in the building whose voice could carry the weight of this moment. Morgan Freeman looked at Jimmy, then at Eleanor, and then at the camera. May I? He asked Eleanor, holding up the letter. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. And then, in that voice, the voice that has narrated the universe, narrated hope, narrated God himself, Morgan Freeman began to read Eleanor's letter aloud. The studio was dead silent. Not a cough. Not a whisper. Not a sound except Morgan's voice, slow and deliberate, honoring every single word Eleanor had written. He read about Michael's courage. About the nights he spent in pain but refused to complain because he didn't want to worry his grandmother. About the dreams he had of becoming a writer, dreams that would never come true. About the last thing Michael said before he closed his eyes for the final time. Tell Jimmy I said thank you. Tell him he made me happy. When Morgan finished reading, he carefully folded the letter and handed it back to Eleanor. But she shook her head. Keep it, she said. Or give it to him. She looked at Jimmy. I want him to have it. So he knows. Morgan took the letter and walked over to Jimmy, who was now sitting on the stage steps, his head in his hands. Morgan placed the letter gently in Jimmy's lap and rested a hand on his shoulder. Jimmy looked up, and for the first time in his career, he didn't try to hide his tears. I didn't know, Jimmy said, his voice breaking. I didn't know he was watching. I didn't know any of this. You couldn't have known, Morgan said gently. But now you do. And now, so does everyone here. The audience rose to their feet. Not in applause. Not yet. They stood in respect. In grief. In solidarity. Jimmy slowly stood up. He took off his tie, the one he'd been adjusting just 20 minutes earlier, and he walked back to Eleanor. He held it out to her. This was my grandfather's, Jimmy said quietly. He gave it to me when I got this job. He told me to wear it on nights when I needed to remember why I do this. He pressed it into Eleanor's hands. I want you to have it. Because your Michael reminded me why I do this. And I'll never forget him. Eleanor clutched the tie to her chest, the same way she'd been holding Michael's photograph. Jimmy turned to the audience, to the cameras, to America watching at home. We're not going to finish the show tonight, he said. I can't. I won't. Because this moment, this story, this woman and her grandson, they matter more than anything I could ever say or do up here. The Roots, who had been standing silently in the corner, began to play something they never played on the show before. Not upbeat. Not celebratory. A soft, gentle melody that felt like a lullaby. Questlove, tears streaming down his face, played with his eyes closed, as if the music itself was a prayer. The audience remained standing. Some were crying openly now. Others held hands with strangers sitting next to them, A young woman in the back row held up her phone, not to record, but to show a picture of her own brother who had passed away from cancer. Then another person held up a photo. And another. And another. Within moments, dozens of photos were raised throughout the studio. Sons. Daughters. Parents. Friends. All gone too soon. All remembered in this sacred, unexpected moment of collective grief. Jimmy saw them all. Every single face. Every single story that would never be told on television but mattered just as much as Michael's. He walked slowly up the aisle, touching hands, looking at photographs, whispering, "I'm sorry," over and over again. Not as a celebrity. Not as a host. As a human being who suddenly understood the weight of what his show meant to people in their darkest hours. When he reached the back of the studio, he turned around. Morgan Freeman was still standing beside Eleanor, his hand on her shoulder, a silent guardian of her grief. "I started this job thinking I was supposed to make people laugh," Jimmy said, his voice stronger now, filled with purpose. "And I love making people laugh. But tonight I learned something more important. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give each other isn't laughter. It's witness. It's seeing each other. It's saying your pain matters. Your story matters. You matter." He looked directly into the camera, speaking not to millions, but to one person at a time. If you're watching this at home, and you've lost someone, I want you to know something. They're not forgotten. Not by you. Not by the people who loved them. And tonight, not by us. Michael mattered. And so does whoever you're thinking of right now. The camera operator, a 20-year veteran who had filmed thousands of shows, had to wipe his eyes to keep shooting. Jimmy walked back to Eleanor. He knelt down one more time. "Can I ask you something?" he said softly. Eleanor nodded. What was Michael's favorite joke? From any show? Any episode? Do you remember? Eleanor smiled through her tears. It was the first time she'd smiled all night. "He loved the one where you and The Rock did that silly handshake," she said. "He made me learn it. We practiced it every day for a week." Jimmy's face lit up. He stood and looked around the studio. "The Rock isn't here tonight," he said. "But I think Michael would want us to do that handshake anyway. Eleanor, will you do it with me?" The audience erupted, not in applause but in joy. Pure, unexpected joy breaking through the sorrow. Eleanor stood up, and Jimmy taught her the ridiculous, complicated handshake right there in the aisle. They messed it up twice. Laughed. Tried again. And on the third try, they nailed it. The studio exploded. People were laughing and crying at the same time, that strange, beautiful mix of emotions that only comes when grief and love collide. He looked back at Eleanor one more time. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for writing that letter. And thank you for trusting me with Michael's story. I promise you, I won't let it be forgotten." The show ended there. The credits rolled over silence. No music. No jokes. Just Morgan Freeman standing beside Jimmy Fallon, both of them looking at a grandmother who had traveled 600 miles to say thank you. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. In the weeks that followed, Jimmy established the Michael's Light Foundation, a nonprofit that grants wishes to terminally ill children who dream of meeting their heroes. He donated his entire salary from that month to fund it. Morgan Freeman became the foundation's spokesperson, and Eleanor became its first board member. The letter Morgan read that night was framed and now hangs in Jimmy's dressing room, right next to his desk, where he sees it every single day before he walks on stage. And the tie, his grandfather's tie, the one he gave to Eleanor? She was buried with it 6 months later, holding it close, just like she held Michael's photograph that night in Studio 6B. Because some stories don't end with laughter. Some stories end with love. And sometimes, the greatest thing a performer can do is stop performing and just be human. That's what Jimmy Fallon did. That's what Morgan Freeman honored. And that's what the world witnessed on a Tuesday night that was never supposed to matter but ended up mattering more than anything else.